It started on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning, the kind of morning that already had its own rhythm before anyone even opened their eyes. Alarms would ring in 1,000 houses, one after another, like a chain reaction. Kettles would boil. Toast would pop. Kids would argue about socks. Parents would check the weather, check traffic, check messages, and check one more thing they couldn't quite name, but always needed to see. Only that morning, the alarms didn't ring. Not in the dramatic way people would later describe it. No sparks, no sudden darkness, no eerie silence across the entire city like a movie. It was just late, too late. A father blinked awake, confused by the brightness through the curtain. His hand went automatically to the bedside table. His fingers found his phone. He pressed the side button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder, like the phone had simply misunderstood. Still nothing. In the next room, a teenager was already awake, not because of an alarm, but because she'd fallen asleep with her phone in her hand. Her thumb moved out of habit, trying to scroll a screen that stayed stubbornly still. The video she'd been watching last night was paused on a face mid-expression, trapped forever between laugh and sentence. She tapped it. She swiped. She frowned. Ugh, she muttered, and did what every human had been trained to do in the modern age. She restarted it. Down the street, in a kitchen full of lunchboxes and half-tied shoelaces, a mother stood in front of the window with her phone held up like a compass. She was trying to check the weather. It didn't load. She tried again. The little circle spun, like it was thinking very hard about whether clouds still existed. A child tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, can I watch something while I eat?" "Not right now, sweetie. It's not working." The child stared at the silent phone as if it had personally betrayed him. Phones weren't supposed to not work. That wasn't in the rules. Phones were the part of life that always stayed the same. If everything else in the world was messy and complicated, at least you could tap a screen and make it behave. The mother tried switching to mobile data, then Wi-Fi, then airplane mode, then back again, like the phone had lungs and she was making it breathe. She looked around the kitchen, suddenly aware of how much of her morning relied on that rectangle. The calendar, the school newsletter, the class group chat, the list of what to pack, the reminder to bring library books, the lunch order app, the map that told her the fastest route, the one she followed so often she'd stopped remembering the streets. She opened her mouth to call her husband in the other room, then remembered she didn't know his number without the phone. That thought landed in her mind with a dull little thud. Not panic, not yet, just a strange kind of emptiness. Across the city, other people were having the same tiny moment. In an office building, a man waited for the lift and stared at his phone while the doors took their time. He tried to reply to a message that wouldn't send. The little failed symbol popped up. He tried again. Then, with the patience of someone used to technology being moody, he shrugged. "Must be an update," he said to no one in particular. In a school car park, parents leaned out of car windows, waving children toward the gate with one hand while holding phones in the other. A few were calling out, "Text me when you get to class," before realizing what they'd just said. Kids walked through the gate with blank looks, clutching backpacks and water bottles and the last crumbs of a world that still made sense. Inside classrooms, teachers tried logging into attendance systems and learning portals and roll-apps that simply refused. The screens stared back like a person pretending they didn't hear you. A teacher sighed and reached for an old paper rollbook that lived in a drawer like a forgotten ancestor. "Well," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice, "this will be a fun throwback." The students laughed politely, not because it was funny, but because laughing was what people did when something felt slightly wrong and they didn't want to admit it. At lunchtime, children tried to show each other videos. At break time, teenagers tried to check their messages. At pickup time, parents tried to coordinate rides. And everywhere, the same sentence floated from mouth to mouth like a comforting spell. Probably just the network. Give it an hour. Maybe the towers are down. Must be an update. By late afternoon, people were still calm enough to be annoyed rather than afraid. They joked about it. They rolled their eyes. They complained like it was bad customer service. Because the idea that it could be permanent, truly permanent, was too ridiculous to even consider. Phones didn't stop working. That wasn't something that happened. The world had rules. And one of those rules was that a screen would light up when you asked it to. That evening, in houses across the city, families sat on couches with their phones on charge, waiting for them to come back. Waiting for the little buzz. Waiting for the world to reboot. And one by one, as the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on, people began to realize that the silence wasn't a short pause. It was the start of something else. Something nobody had rehearsed for. By midday, the patience people had borrowed from the morning began to run out. The first real crack appeared at the checkout counters. A woman stood at the front of a grocery store line with a basket full of bread, fruit, and milk balanced on her hip. She smiled politely at the teenager behind the register as he tapped the screen, then tapped it again. The machine made a sound it wasn't supposed to make, short, flat, unhelpful. "I'm sorry," he said, cheeks flushing. It's not going through." She laughed at first, the way people did when they assumed the problem would solve itself if they stayed pleasant. "Oh, it's fine. I'll just—" She held her phone over the terminal. Nothing happened. The line behind her shifted. Someone sighed. Someone checked their watch, then checked their phone, then frowned at the blank screen like it had personally insulted them. The manager was called, then the manager's manager. The terminals were rebooted. The internet was blamed. The power was checked, even though the lights were still on and the fridge hummed steadily behind the counter. Finally, someone slid open the old cash drawer and stared into it like it was a museum exhibit. "Do you have cash?" the manager asked. The woman blinked. Cash. She couldn't remember the last time she'd carried it. Neither could anyone else in line. Across town, the same thing was happening. Cafes couldn't process orders. Petrol stations taped handwritten signs to pumps. ATMs stood silent, their screens dark and unresponsive, like they were asleep or pretending to be. At schools, the confusion thickened. Announcements crackled over intercoms, half decided and quickly revised. Timetables couldn't be accessed. Digital roll marks vanished into nothing. Teachers tried to reassure students, while quietly realizing they had no way to contact parents if something went wrong. Kids felt the shift before they understood it. They fidgeted more. They stared at walls. They reached for pockets that no longer offered comfort. A few cried, not because anything terrible had happened, but because something familiar was missing, and they didn't have words for that feeling yet. Teenagers felt it differently. They were quieter than usual, their hands restless, their eyes scanning rooms like they were waiting for something to reappear. They whispered to one another, asking if messages were working yet, if anyone had heard anything, if someone somewhere knew what was going on. Adults, meanwhile, had their own uncomfortable realization. They didn't know numbers. Not really. They knew names and faces and profile pictures and conversation threads, but not the strings of digits that connected them to people they loved. They stood in hallways and kitchens and car parks, phones in hand, trying to remember how to reach someone without a screen to guide them. A father sat in his car outside a school long after dismissal time, watching children pour out through the gate in clusters. His daughter wasn't among them. He opened his phone again, like opening a door he already knew was locked. "Where are you? Did you walk home? Are you with someone?" The questions stayed trapped inside his head. Across the city, the noise rose. Car horns, raised voices, doors slamming, people talking over one another in streets and shops, trying to solve the same problem in 100 different ways. The air buzzed with nervous energy, like a storm gathering just out of sight. Then, slowly, something else happened. The noise began to fade. People stopped pacing and started standing still. Conversations trailed off. Phones were lowered. The realization spread, not through alerts or headlines, but through eye contact. No one knew where anyone else was. There were no live updates, no location pins, no group chats lighting up with reassurance. Just people, standing where they were, wondering. Cities had always been loud, even when they pretended not to be. There was always a hum, notifications, music bleeding from headphones, voices from phone calls, the constant background murmur of connection. Now that hum was gone. In its place was a different kind of quiet. Not peaceful, not yet. It was the quiet of something missing. By late afternoon, people weren't joking anymore. They weren't saying, "must be an update." They were saying things like, "Has anyone heard anything? Is this happening everywhere? Do they know what's wrong?" And for the first time, the answer was the same, no matter who you asked. No one knew. And there was no screen left to pretend otherwise. That evening, something unusual happened. Families stayed in the same room. Not because they had planned to, not because it was meaningful or intentional, simply because there was nowhere else to go that didn't feel unfinished. No notifications pulling people away. No screens quietly whispering that something more interesting was happening somewhere else. They sat at tables longer than normal. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked, someone coughed. A father cleared his throat and immediately regretted it, because now everyone was looking at him like he was supposed to say something important. "So," he said, nodding at no one in particular, "how was everyone's day?" It came out like a question and an apology at the same time. His teenage son stared at him. "You were there," he said. "We all were." "Oh," the father replied. "Right. Yes. Of course." The conversation stalled again. Kids, unused to this much uninterrupted eye contact, shifted in their chairs. One swung her legs back and forth until her foot bumped the table. "Mom," she said slowly, "what did you do when you were bored? When you were little?" The question landed with unexpected weight. The mother blinked, surprised by how long it took her to answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We went outside a lot. We made things up." "Like what?" the child asked. The mother opened her mouth, then paused. She realized she couldn't remember when she'd last had to invent fun from nothing. Teenagers fared worse. One sat slumped on the couch, staring out the window like a dramatic character in an old movie. The clouds drifted past. Birds landed on the fence. The world carried on with absolutely no regard for the fact that his group chat was silent. "This is," he said slowly, "the longest day of my life." "It's been 12 hours, his sister replied. "That's what makes it impressive." In kitchens across the city, adults attempted tasks they'd forgotten required thinking. Someone tried to cook dinner without a recipe app and discovered they didn't actually know how long rice was supposed to boil. Someone else realized they couldn't remember their own address without checking it first. A couple stood in their hallway, arguing gently about which bin night it was, both convinced the other was wrong. "Well, I'd normally just check," one of them said. "Yes," the other replied, gesturing broadly at the powerless phone in their hand. "So would the rest of the modern world." People wandered too. They stepped outside and walked without headphones, without destinations, without knowing why they'd gone out in the first place. A woman found herself standing in front of a neighbor's house, wondering how long it would be socially acceptable to knock when she hadn't texted first. She knocked anyway. The neighbor answered, equally uncertain. "Hi," the woman said. "I didn't know what else to do." The neighbor smiled, relieved. "Same." Inside, children sprawled on the floor, staring at ceilings like they were brand new. Someone discovered an old cupboard game missing 3 pieces and suggested playing anyway. There was debate. There were rules invented. There were rules ignored. There was laughter, surprised and slightly rusty. Adults began to notice something uncomfortable. They had outsourced more than just memory. They'd outsourced time, directions, decisions, distraction. The tiny moments between moments that used to belong to thought. Now those moments were back. and they didn't know what to do with them yet. By the end of the night, people were tired in a way they hadn't been for a long time. Not drained by screens, but full from effort, from talking, from thinking, from being. As lights went out in houses across the city, phones sat charging on bedside tables like loyal pets waiting for a command that never came. And for the first time, people fell asleep not to the glow of a screen, but to the unfamiliar sound of their own thoughts. The second day arrived without urgency. There was no alarm to race, no notifications demanding attention before breakfast. People woke more slowly, blinking at the light through their windows like it had something to say. Phones were checked, of course. Old habits didn't vanish overnight. Screens were tapped, buttons were pressed, chargers were swapped. Still nothing. There was disappointment, but also something else now. A quiet acceptance settling in, like realizing the rain wasn't going to stop, and deciding to walk anyway. Children adapted faster than anyone expected. One child pulled a dusty box from the back of a cupboard and dumped its contents onto the carpet. Board game pieces scattered everywhere. Dice that didn't match. Cards bent at the corners. A spinner that squeaked like it was protesting being used again. The instructions were missing, which led to a brief argument, and then a unanimous decision that the rules would simply be invented. The game lasted for hours. It wasn't smooth. There were disagreements, accusations of cheating, dramatic exits followed by equally dramatic returns. No one Googled the answer. No one checked a tutorial. They solved it themselves, which somehow made winning feel less important than playing. Outside, children began appearing on the street, one by one, like they were being released from invisible doors. Someone rode a bike in slow, careful circles. Someone else chalked crooked lines on the pavement and announced them to be borders, goals, or traps depending on the moment. A fence became lava. A tree became base. A stick became a sword, then a microphone, then a very serious scientific instrument. Adults watched from windows and verandas, confused by how loud laughter sounded when it wasn't competing with anything else. Inside houses, forgotten objects were being rediscovered. A man twisted the dial of an old radio, fingers patient as static hissed and popped. Music emerged, warped but familiar. He turned it up anyway. A woman found a notebook she'd bought years ago with the intention of journaling. The first page stayed blank. The second became a list. The third became a memory. Someone baked without checking a recipe and called it experimental. Someone else burnt dinner and declared it a lesson in humility. Neighbors began knocking. At first, people stood on doorsteps awkwardly, holding casseroles, spare batteries, or simply a question they didn't know how to phrase without an emoji. "I just wanted to see if you were okay," became a perfectly acceptable reason to visit. Conversations stretched longer than expected. People learned names they'd never bothered to ask for. Kids introduced themselves without being prompted. Dogs made new friends. Someone offered tea, then biscuits, then a chair. Not everything went well. Someone forgot a meeting entirely and arrived an hour late with no way to explain except honesty. Someone walked 3 streets too far and had to ask for directions, discovering that people gave directions with stories attached now. "Oh, you'll want to turn left where the big tree used to be, or maybe it's the one with the crooked fence. You'll know it when you see it." It took longer, but nobody seemed to mind. Kids grew bored again by late afternoon. Then they didn't. They built forts that collapsed and were rebuilt stronger. They told stories that contradicted themselves, and no one corrected them. They learned something quietly important, that boredom wasn't a failure. It was the beginning of invention. Adults started writing things down. Phone numbers, once shared casually, were carefully copied onto scraps of paper. Addresses were memorized, then double-checked. Plans were spoken aloud and repeated, just to be sure. That evening, streets filled with the sound of people talking to one another without glancing away. Music drifted from open windows. Laughter carried farther than it used to. The world still wasn't fixed, but it was holding together. Not perfectly, just enough. By the third day, something had changed. Not in a way that could be measured or announced. There were no headlines to mark it, no updates to explain it. It showed itself in small, quiet habits, things people did without realizing they were doing them. People stopped checking their phones first thing in the morning. They still reached for them sometimes, out of reflex, but the urgency was gone. The disappointment, too. The phones had become what they were, silent objects, useful once. Interesting now, only as reminders of a world that moved faster than anyone had noticed. Routes were being memorized again. People walked to places they used to be guided to, paying attention to landmarks instead of arrows. A bakery was remembered by its smell, a corner by the sound of traffic, a house by the crooked letterbox, or the tree that dropped leaves everywhere in autumn. Children led the way more often than adults. They noticed things, shortcuts through parks, gaps in fences, which streets had the friendliest dogs. Adults followed, slightly embarrassed by how much they had forgotten to look. Meals began to stretch. Without screens waiting nearby, dinner didn't end when the last bite was taken. People lingered. They talked about their days in more detail than fine or busy. Stories were shared that had never felt important enough before. Memories surfaced, then connected, then sparked laughter. Someone brought out an old guitar. The strings were out of tune. No one knew all the words. It didn't matter. Music filled the room anyway, uneven and alive. Kids clapped. Someone hummed. Someone else joined in halfway through with confidence they didn't quite earn. Boredom arrived again, as it always did. This time, it didn't scare anyone. Kids sat with it, fidgeted with it, pushed against it, and then, almost magically, turned it into something else. Drawings, games, questions, plans. Adults watched this happen with something like awe. They remembered suddenly what boredom used to be. A doorway. Days passed without the world falling apart. Work adjusted. Schools adapted. Communities organized themselves with whiteboards, notice boards, and conversations that traveled by foot instead of fiber. People learned each other's schedules because they had to listen. There were still moments of frustration, missed connections, wrong times, lost notes. But there was also patience now, a sense that mistakes weren't disasters. They were just part of being human again. By the end of the week, laughter sounded different, louder, less filtered, more surprised. The silence between sounds no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. People weren't waiting for the phones anymore. They were waiting for each other. No one could point to the exact moment the waiting ended. At first, people had lived as though the silence were temporary, a pause that would resolve itself if they stayed alert enough. Phones had been kept close, charged carefully, checked often. Each day began with a small private hope that the world would snap back into place while they slept. But days passed, and then more, and slowly the waiting loosened its grip. Phones remained where they had always been, on kitchen benches, tucked into bags, resting on bedside tables. They were still there, still silent, still capable of reminding people of what used to be. But they no longer held authority. They were objects again. Tools, not anchors. People noticed the change in the quietest places. In the way mornings unfolded without urgency. In the way children drifted into kitchens, asking questions instead of asking for screens. In the way adults paused before answering, choosing words carefully now that there was nothing rushing them forward. Without screens to interrupt them, people learned to sit with one another again. They sat on front steps as the light shifted across the street. They sat at tables long after plates were cleared. They sat beside one another in comfortable silence, discovering that being present didn't always require conversation. They began to notice things they had once overlooked. The way someone's shoulders relaxed when they were finally heard. The rhythm of footsteps approaching from behind. The small joy of recognizing a face before a name, and a name before a profile picture. They learned to listen. Not the distracted listening that waited for gaps to speak, but the kind that stayed, that allowed stories to wander and circle back, that made room for hesitation and honesty. Words were no longer skimmed or scrolled past. They landed, they stayed, and they learned to remember. Not because reminders popped up or photos were taken automatically, but because moments mattered enough to be carried. A shared laugh, a difficult conversation, a song played imperfectly on an old instrument, a child's question that didn't need an immediate answer. The silence that followed the final notification was not empty. It was full of voices overlapping in kitchens, of laughter echoing down streets, of mistakes that were met with patience instead of panic, of time that belonged to the people living inside it. The world had not become simpler. Problems still existed. Life still asked things of people. But the constant hum of urgency, the feeling that something else was always happening somewhere else, had faded. In its place was attention, presence, a sense that being here now was enough. The world didn't collapse when the phones went quiet. It softened, edges dulled, corners rounded. Space appeared where there had once been noise. And in that softness, something essential returned, something that had never been lost, only buried. Connection, not measured in bars or signals or data, but in shared air, shared time, shared silence. The world didn't end. It finally began to listen,